Intangible benefits means so much of benefit that you can't even think about. That is what we are getting from nature. Why should we try to conserve it? No, it is also a part of the environment. Ex situ conservation means you're taking an animal from a forest, bringing it somewhere else and then protecting it. Such large number of plants and animals, you cannot conserve them through ex situ conservation. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to the last session of chapter 15 of second PUC, that is Biodiversity and Conservation. I am Dr. Divya, Biology Faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru, Temple of Excellence. So in the previous session, we had discussed about the biodiversity losses and what are the reasons for biodiversity and losses and how to prevent it. In today's session, let us discuss about the conservation of biodiversity and how to conserve biodiversity. Let us learn with biodiversity conservation. So why should we conserve biodiversity? The main reason is the next coming generation that are there, they should not be put into trouble. So that is one of the reason, and also the present generation who are living at currently, we also should not face any adverse effects from the nature. So that is why conservation of biodiversity is very, very important. So the need for conservation of biodiversity is actually grouped into three main categories, that is narrowly utilitarian, broadly utilitarian and ethical. For these three reasons, biodiversity has to be conserved. So first let's study about the narrowly utilitarian. So according to narrowly utilitarian, conserving biodiversity is obvious because we use fuel, we use forest wood, we use paper daily. So for all that, obviously if we need to continue with all those pleasures, we need to conserve the biodiversity. So therefore, conserving biodiversity are obvious according to narrowly utilitarian category of biodiversity conservation. So we human beings, we get a lot of benefits from the nature. That is, a lot of economic benefits from the nature in the form of food, in the form of firewood, in the form of fiber, in the form of materials for construction, in the form of industrial products and also products of medicinal importance. So, talking about firewood is needed for the making of coal, and not just that, firewood is also used even today for many purposes and many industries as well as household. So, for that we need trees and we need to depend directly on the nature, and for food also we need to depend on the nature. For the fiber that is needed to make ropes and all those things, we need to depend on nature, and for industrial products or also we need to depend on nature, such as to make lubricants, to make leather, to make tannins, to make dyes, resins and to make some perfumes. That also we directly get it from the plants, right? So resins are nothing but the gum-like things that is got from the plant. So all that we need to directly depend on the nature. And also for construction materials, because for the flooring or for the wall construction, if we need wood, then we need to depend on the biodiversity or nature directly. And also there are a lot of medicinal products that are got from nature. So therefore, obviously people or we human beings, we have to depend on nature, and therefore we need to conserve nature. So more than 25% of the drugs that are currently sold in the market throughout the world are said to be derived from plant species, and out of that 25,000 plant species are the ones that actually contribute to traditional or Ayurvedic medicines which are used by the native people even today around the world, right? So, and not just that, even the pharmaceutical medicines are also nothing but a base of the Ayurvedic medicine itself. So that is why most of the 25% of the medicines are derived from the forest or derived from the nature, from the plant itself. So that is why if we need to continue with Ayurvedic medicine even further, then or traditional form of medicine even further in the future generation, then we need to conserve biodiversity. So next is with increasing resources put into bioprospecting. So bioprospecting is nothing but those using of biological tools for molecular purposes for genetic purposes and for species level diversity to create important economic products. So for all these, we need some organisms from the environment itself. And if we need those organisms, say for example microbes, if we need microbes, then we need good amount of moisture in the environment. So if we need good amount of moisture in the environment, then we need to get good amounts of rain. If we need to get good amounts of rain, we need to have good amounts of forest, right? Forest reserve. So that is how each one is linked to one another, and for that particular purpose, for bioprospecting, we need to conserve the biodiversity. And the nations endowed with rich biodiversity can expect to reap enormous benefits, because a lot of molecular and genetic related studies can be done by keeping the species as a base, and therefore those nations can economically benefit from that. So for that purpose also, the safeguarding or the conservation of biodiversity is very, very important. Next is broadly utilitarian. So according to broadly utilitarian, biodiversity plays a very, very important role in many ecosystem services that the nature provides. So if we need to enjoy these ecosystem services even in the future, then we need to conserve biodiversity. So that is what this strategy is. So the fast dwindling Amazon forest. So Amazon forest, when compared to the earlier area of which it covered, nowadays the hectares of the Amazon forest is diminishing or coming down rapidly, or it is decreasing. So the fast dwindling Amazon forest, which is estimated to produce through photosynthesis 20% of the total oxygen of the Earth's atmosphere. That is why Amazon forest is called as the lungs of the planet, right? Because 20% of the oxygen that is given to the Earth's atmosphere comes from the Amazon rainforest, because Amazon rainforest is abundantly rich with the plant species. So that is the reason. But the Amazon rainforest is shrinking because of the human intervention, wherein they are converting the Amazon rainforest into grazing lands and also into crop fields. Therefore, reduction in the emission of oxygen into the atmosphere, liberation of oxygen into the atmosphere. So that is why if we need to get good content of atmospheric oxygen, then it is very important for us to safeguard the Amazon forest, and therefore the need for biodiversity conservation arises. Next is pollination. We need to conserve biodiversity keeping pollination in mind, because without pollination, plants can never give us fruits or seeds, right? And if fruits or seeds are not formed, then the next generation of plants cannot be got. Of course, you can ask me, we can get it through tissue culture, we can get it through various laboratory methodologies, but how long will you depend on them? You cannot, right? Because nature is nature. That is why naturally to get seeds and all that, it is not possible if pollination does not occur. Pollination means wherein the setting of seeds because of the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of another flower, and it is facilitated by the pollinators such as the bees, birds and all that. So therefore, if we cut down trees and if we destroy the forest and flowering plants, then the bees will automatically get destroyed, because bees are the major pollinators among all the other animals that are there. And if bees are not there, then pollination will not occur. If pollination doesn't occur, fruits will not form. If fruits doesn't form, seeds will not form. And if seeds doesn't form, then the next set of plants we will not get. So that is why facilitate pollination also, the need for conservation of biodiversity is very, very important. An ecosystem provided through pollinators, that is bees, bumblebees, birds and bats. All these are the different pollinators, among which bees are the major pollinators. So therefore, destruction of the forest also will lead to the destruction of the insects and the fruits. Therefore, it will be a problem to the birds and the bats as well, because of scarcity of food, and that will indirectly affect the pollination as well. So that is why conservation is we should not just narrowly think about conservation, but broad thinking about the conservation of biodiversity is also very, very important here. There are also other intangible benefits. So intangible benefits means so much of benefit that you can't even think about. That is what we are getting from nature. But are we giving back the same equal quantity to nature? Never, right? Because we human beings, we are always greedy. So there are other intangible benefits that we derive from nature. So that is for the aesthetic pleasure of walking through thick woods, watching spring flowers in full bloom, or waking up to the bulbul song in the morning. That is true, right? How relaxed we feel after a day full of work when you go to a park or when you go into the woods and take a walk, right? You feel so relaxed. You feel all your happy hormones will get activated and you feel so stress-free and relaxed. The same thing will you get when you do exercise between the four walls? No, that is not God. So that is what nature can provide. And not just that, how beautiful it is to watch the flowers bloom during the spring season. Even in cities also, when a tree has bloomed with full of flowers, we find it quite mesmerizing, right? And automatically there will be a smile and happiness in our face. So all that you cannot get it through artificial means. And also how good it is to hear the birds chirping in the morning. When you wake up and you hear the birds singing, it is so beautiful, right? So all that you cannot, will the same effect will you get it if you record it in your mobile and listen to it daily? No, that's not possible. So that is why nature has its own way of calming and relaxing the human mind, which no other technology can provide. So for at least for that purpose, it is very, very important for us to conserve the biodiversity. All of us, we at least, instead of going into a restaurant or something, whenever we get a weekend or weekend, we try to get away from the cities. We try to go into greenery, right? If you need that enjoyment for the future also, then we need to start thinking of conserving the biodiversity. So that is why biodiversity conservation is very, very important. Next, talking about ethical. So what are the ethical means why we need to conserve the biodiversity? According to the ethical category of biodiversity conservation, they say that what we owe to millions of plants, animal and microbe species with whom we share this planet. So it is not always, human beings should not always have the habit of taking. You take something, you give back to that person, right? You give back. Similarly, like that also, from the nature, you take something from the nature, it is your duty to give back to the nature. Otherwise, what happens? Every now and then you take something from the nature and you don't give it back. One day the nature will become exhausted and your life will be put in a trauma or it will be put in a bad state. So that is why, that is what is ethical. We need to have some ethics. We need to have some norms towards nature. We need to have some love or care towards nature, at least that pittiness. Okay, I'm cutting a tree, I'm hurting a tree, let me plant a tree for that particular purpose, because obviously we human beings, we cannot live without depending on the environment. We need to, but when we take something from the environment, always make sure that you return it back in one or the other ways. So philosophically or spiritually, we need to realize that every species has an intrinsic value. That is, each and every species, whether it is abiotic or biotic, or whether it is non-living or living, it has its own value and it needs its own respect that has to be given. So even if it may not be of current or any economic value to us. So it may not be of any use to us, but still you might think, what is it? What is a butterfly a use to us? Why should we try to conserve it? No, it is also a part of the environment. It is also living as one among us. So everything, be it any small thing, has to be given its own respect and its own care. So that philosophy or that ethical value should be taught right from the small age itself, to value each and every little things that are there on this planet. So we have a moral duty to care for their well-being and pass on our biological legacy in good order to the future generation. So why? Because the future generation that are there, they will learn by looking into what we do, right? It is always said that the children learn from the adults. That is quite true, right? So they try to follow the adults. So if the adults inculcate in them the habit of keeping this area clean, keeping the city clean, keeping the biodiversity clean, or conserving the biodiversity, planting trees, then the same interest will get inculcated in the young generation as well. So that is how, if we people or the current generation maintain the ethical values, and if we maintain the philosophical and spiritual love towards nature, then the younger generation will also learn from it, and they'll carry that legacy of conserving biodiversity in the future as well. So this is about ethical. So here, next let's study. So we know about the different reasons why we need to conserve biodiversity. Now the question is, how can we conserve biodiversity? So biodiversity can be conserved in two forms. One is in situ conservation and the other one is ex situ conservation. So in situ conservation means within an area itself. So when we conserve and protect the whole ecosystem, its biodiversity at all levels is protected. Then we save the entire forest to save the tiger. That is true, right? So what we do here is that forest itself, if we save, it means that we are saving the tiger as well. So that is in situ conservation. So in situ conservation means there is a forest. In that forest, tigers are there. So you preserve that forest itself, there itself, so that, or conserve that forest there itself, so that the tiger gets protected from the poachers or because of other human intervention. So this approach is called as in situ or on-site conservation. So we have various examples of in situ conservation like national parks, biosphere reserve. That is done in the forest itself, right? Where the area is protected in such a way that whatever animal is living there, that also gets protected. So that is in situ conservation. Next, talking about ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation means you're taking an animal from a forest, bringing it somewhere else and then protecting it, like a zoo or a captive breeding center or a botanical garden if it is a plant. So that is ex situ conservation. So situations where an animal or plant is endangered or threatened, or those species which are at the verge or at the risk of becoming extinction in the near future, these organisms, that is plants and animals, they need urgent measures to save it from extinction. So in such times, we cannot preserve it where it is. We'll have to bring it. Say for example, only there is a tiger remaining. All the other tigers have become vanished. Now that alone tiger, can you leave it in the forest like that and say that you're trying to conserve it? It's not possible. In situ conservation is not possible there. At that time, you'll have to choose ex situ conservation, wherein you'll bring the tiger to a breeding center. You'll try to breed it through genetic methodologies and molecular methodologies, and then you'll try to increase its population in the captive or the breeding center. So that is called as ex situ conservation. So talking about in situ conservation in detail, so faced with the conflict between development and conservation, many nations find it unrealistic and economically not feasible to conserve all their biological wealth. So invariably, the number of species that are waiting to be saved from extinction far exceeds the conservation resources available. So on a global basis, this problem has been addressed by eminent conservationists. So in situ conservation, what happens here is sometimes in captive breeding and all that, we are not able to bring all the species to the captive breeding center. So for ex situ conservation and preserve them there by providing whatever they need, it is difficult. So in such times, it is always better to conserve those organisms in a larger area where they in their own natural habitat itself. So that can be done through in situ conservation. So they identified, so some of the naturalists, what they did was they identified for maximum protection certain, that is they identified biodiversity hotspots. Say for example, Western Ghats. Western Ghats is very, very vast, and there are a lot of reptiles in the Western Ghats which are at the verge of extinction, and there are a lot of plants in the Western Ghats which are at the verge of extinction. So such large number of plants and animals, you cannot conserve them through ex situ conservation. One or two it's okay, fine, you can conserve them through ex situ conservation. But on a large scale, it is very, very difficult to conserve them. So that is when what government do is, some areas, they'll mark it as biodiversity hotspots, wherein no human intervention, not even 1% of human intervention will be allowed, so that the plants and the animals growing there can replenish themselves, and therefore they can increase their population or number. So that is how it is done. So the biodiversity hotspots are usually selected with regions with very high levels of species richness and where there is high degree of endemism. Endemism means it is meant to only particular area. Nowhere else in the world you can find that particular species. Say for example, there is a reptile species which can be found only in the Western Ghat. Apart from the Western Ghat, you cannot bring it out of the Western Ghat and you cannot protect it in other environmental condition. At that time, you will have to preserve it there itself. That is how the government identifies such spots as biodiversity hotspots, so that the species which are at the verge of extinction can get preserved naturally in their own habitat itself. So this is about in situ conservation. So initially 25 biodiversity hotspots were identified, but out of the 25 biodiversity hotspots, 9 more have been added to the list. So therefore 25 plus 9 has been added, and bringing the total number of biodiversity hotspots in the world to 34. So totally at present, there are 34 biodiversity hotspots which are not allowed for human beings, and therefore because of the restricted human intervention or no human intervention, the species richness is developing there. So these hotspots are also regions for accelerated habitat loss as well. And 3 of these hotspots, that is the Western Ghats and Sri Lanka, the Indo-Burma and the Himalaya, they cover a country's exceptionally high biodiversity region. So in our country, the Western Ghats is one of the, up from the Western Ghats to Sri Lanka, from Indo-Burman region and the Himalayan region, the entire belt of Himalayan region, all these are the biodiversity hotspots which are rich in quite a number of species. Himalaya especially is rich in a lot of medicinal plants which is found nowhere else in the world, endemic plants that are there in the Himalayas. So all these have been marked as biodiversity hotspot, so that these places, because of human intervention, habitat loss and fragmentation will not occur. Therefore, the species can get conserved there. So all the biodiversity hotspots put together, it covers less than 2% of the Earth's land area. But still, in these biodiversity hotspots, because of the richness in the plant population, the number of species that they collectively harbor, or the number of species present in those biodiversity hotspots, are extremely high, and therefore strict protection of these hotspots are considered, because it can reduce the ongoing mass extinctions by almost 30%. So that is why biodiversity hotspots are maintained, so that at least 30% of the plant species and animal species can be conserved in a natural manner. So only 2% of the land area is covered by Earth's land area has rich collection of species diversity, which has been marked as biodiversity hotspot. So at least safeguarding that 2% will conserve a lot of species here. So in India, ecologically unit and biodiversity rich regions, they are legally protected as biosphere reserves. So biosphere reserves, national parks and sanctuaries, they are the best examples for in situ conservation. In biosphere reserve also, there itself in the natural habitat, the plants and animals are conserved. Even in national parks and sanctuaries also. Even sanctuaries, can you enter into any area of the sanctuaries? No, not possible. Where they have made place wherein the tourists can be taken, only through that place under strict rules and regulation you will be allowed to enter into the forest, right? So that is how the biodiversity is conserved. So India at present has about 14 biosphere reserves, and there are 90 national parks, and there are 448 wildlife sanctuaries currently in India. And apart from that, India also has a history of religious and cultural tradition. So this religious and cultural, that is India is a country which has some ethical values when compared to other countries, and Indians since age old itself, they have the habit of worshipping nature, and till today also they have carried out this particular habit of worshipping nature, and that religious and cultural tradition has also helped in safeguarding the forest through in situ, and that is also a form of in situ conservation. So, sacred grove is one of the best examples. So, we'll study about that later. In many cultures, tracts of forest were set aside and all the trees and wildlife within these forests were venerated and given total protection. So, what they do here is like how temples are built and temples are protected and taken care of. Just like that, few places wherein they worship the forest, they have made the land, they have put boundaries and they have made that piece of land as a conserved land because it is meant for only worshipping. Therefore, in that plot of land, the plants and animals are protected very well. So, the best example for an ethical conservation and in situ conservation is sacred grove. So, because of the ethics of the people, the sacred groves have developed. So, sacred groves are found in Meghalaya. They are the Khasi and Jaintia hills in Meghalaya. They are found in the Aravalli hills of Rajasthan, and we can find them in the Western Ghat regions of Karnataka and also in regions of Maharashtra and Sarguja, Chanda and Bastar areas of Madhya Pradesh as well. And apart from that, in the northern parts in Meghalaya, the sacred groves are also present, and the sacred groves are the last hope or the last refugees for a large number of rare and threatened plant species, because Meghalaya is also one of the rich biodiversity rich state, right? And it has a variety of orchids that are there which needs to be protected. So all that naturally gets protected because of the sacred grove. So here we have taken the example of a sacred grove. So what they do is in a plot of forest itself, they'll put some idol of God or some idol they'll put and they'll start worshipping. So that people will have a fear that none of that, within that plot, nothing should be disturbed because it belongs to God. So that is how through sacred groves, biodiversity is conserved. So this is also a kind of in situ conservation itself. So next, talking about ex situ conservation. So in ex situ conservation, the animals which are threatened, which are at the verge of extinction, along with the plants also, the threatened plants also, they are taken out from their natural habitat and they are put in special setting where they can be protected and given special care. For example, zoological parks. In zoological parks, they are protected. They are given proper food, proper medication. They are protected. And zoological parks, we also can visit and have a look standing in a far distance, right? Example is zoological parks, then botanical gardens. Then we have the wildlife safari parks. All these are the ex situ conservation where animals are taken from their natural habitat and put into a habitat which serves a purpose as a natural habitat to them itself. So there are many animals that have become extinct in the wild but continue to be maintained in zoological parks. So that is how those animals which are not found in the natural habitat, they can be seen in the zoological parks because proper conservation. So white tigers, for example, they are nothing but the albino tigers which are very rare. You can't find them in the forest, but in the zoological parks you can find them. The white peacocks, albino peacocks, or there are many species of birds and animals also that is in the natural forest, but you can find them in the zoological parks. So in recent years, ex situ conservation has become quite advanced, wherein they do not keep the threatened species in enclosures. Now, what can be done is, apart from keeping from threatened species from enclosures, what can be done is, their gametes can be isolated. So, gametes means the male and the female, the male sperm and the female egg will be isolated. It will be preserved in liquid nitrogen, which is called as, or in very cold temperature, which is called as cryopreservation. and then whenever needed, they will go in for fusing of these gametes and development of a new organism. We all have seen, right, in YouTube channel and all, it keeps coming how from the egg without the mother's support itself, from the egg how a chick is developed. In China, they have already done this particular experiment. So that is how it is done nowadays. Instead of bringing the animal and keeping it in a zoology park, it is like torturing the animal as well, because it will be in an enclosure, it will be in a cage, right? It will be in a small area. So instead of that, now advanced methodologies have come, as I told you earlier. So here what they do is they collect the gametes, that is the male sperm and the female egg, or if it is plants, they collect the seeds and or they'll collect the pollen grain of the threatened species, and they will preserve it in viable and fertile conditions for long period. That is using methods called as cryopreservation technique. So cryopreservation, as I told you, under very cold temperature conditions, it is maintained. So here, whenever needed, the eggs can be fertilized in vitro and the plants can be propagated using tissue culture methods. It can be taken, the seed can be taken, it can be put into a media, proper media, that from that media the callus will develop, and from that callus the plantlets can be got. So that is how thousands of plants can be got from one single seed through tissue culture. So that is how recent technologies have improved, and seeds of different genetic strains of commercially important plants can be kept for long periods in seed banks. So you all might have heard of seed vaults and seed banks. Even India has one seed vault or seed bank in Antarctica. So in Antarctica, there is a seed bank or seed vault. Because it is so cold, the seeds get preserved there, and they can be preserved for such a long period of time. Whenever a plant becomes extinct, those seeds can be propagated through tissue culture and the plants can be regenerated. So that is how ex situ conservation is done. So instead of bringing the plant and putting it somewhere in a botanical garden, or instead of bringing the animal and putting it in a zoological park, the recent technologies such as cryopreservation, tissue culture, all that can be followed, or the maintenance in seed banks, all that can be done. So biodiversity, actually, it has no political boundaries. Nothing has to do with the politics here, because be it a politician or be it a common man, if he needs to survive, money can't help. If nature is only not providing to what he wants, then can he feed on money? No, he'll have to depend on nature for everything, right? So that is why biodiversity knows no political boundaries, and its conservation is therefore a collective responsibility of each and every person that is living on this planet. So the historic convention on biological diversity, that is the Earth Summit, it was held for the first time in Rio de Janeiro in the year 1992, wherein all the conservationists, all the naturalists and different people were called from different nations, and a discussions or meeting was conducted in order to take appropriate measures for conservation of biodiversity and also for the sustainable utilization of the biodiversity. So sustainable utilization means you have to utilize the resources from the biodiversity in such a way that you leave it for the future generation also. It is not that, don't become greedy that, okay, if I survive now, it is enough. Whatever happens to the future generation, I don't take care of. That thought should not be there. So how you can maintain the sustainable development in the environment and how you can conserve the biodiversity, all those talks related to the conservation of nature was discussed in this Earth Summit, which had started in 1992. And later on, one more World Summit was conducted, that is World Summit especially for the sustainable development, and it was held in the year 2002. That is in Johannesburg, South Africa. And 190 countries, people from 190 countries participated in that particular meeting, and they took an oath or they gave a commitment stating that by the time of 2010, there will be a drastic reduction in the current rate of biodiversity loss at the global, regional and local level. So 2002 they met, they took a pledge, they took an oath stating that we will try to conserve biodiversity and reduce the loss of biodiversity by the time 2010 comes in. So that is what the ideas are put forward how to conserve and what problems that they are facing for conserving biodiversity. Everything is discussed in this particular Earth Summit. So with this, the chapter comes to an end. So we shall meet again in the coming sessions with a new chapter. Thank you.